Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about Charles Trevelyan's political views. And now, if you're Irish, you're probably thinking, oh, Jesus Christ, not this guy. And that's because 2 centuries after the Irish potato famine, his name still conjures much distaste in Ireland. Whether in Evan Boylan's poem, The Famine Road, or Pete St. John's, The Fields of Athenry, he is not immortalised kindly. Usually his name is used as a target for Irish hostility towards British rule and mismanagement. This is quite understanding, given he was head of the British funding for aid relief in Ireland from 1845 until the end of the famine. However, as is often the case, the truth is more complicated. This video will focus on Trevelyan's own history of the famine, written in 1850. Like all histories, it is biased in that his environment shaped his view and attitude towards the famine, and with it the narrative of the text. But the text does reflect both his political and social views, which is the focus for today's video. Before we get to that, however, we must first discuss his life before he became Assistant Treasurer of the United Kingdom. Trevelyan's background was one to be expected for a man of his status. Born into a family of 9 in 1807, he was the 4th son of George Trevelyan. Trevelyan Sr. was a Protestant minister and the 4th Baronet of Nettlecombe, with these lands being in the family since 1452. He had a successful career in the Anglican Church, becoming Archdeacon for his home in Taunton, England. His wife Harriet was a daughter of a wealthy merchant, Richard Neave, who also had a successful career as a governor of the Bank of England. As such, Trevelyan Jr. was born into a wealthy and well-connected family, being exposed to both religion and politics at a young age. He was well educated himself and soon began a career in the British Civil Service in India. He gained a reputation for being hard on corruption, bringing his superior officer to justice on such charges. This and his skill for languages caused him to quickly rise through the ranks of the East India Company. During his time in India, he successfully campaigned for greater educational rights for native Indians. His account on the topic, entitled On the Education of the People of India, documents this period. Returning later to Britain, he continued his civil service career and was the highest ranking servant at the outbreak of the Irish Famine in 1845. This put him as the 3rd most powerful government official at the time, and he would hold this post until 1850. As such, he was involved in famine relief for Ireland throughout the period, serving under 2 different cabinets. During those years, he also released his work, The Irish Crisis, which documents his work and opinions on the disaster. His work is of course quite valuable as a source for historians and has been much studied. The work also serves as a good insight into how Trevelyan viewed the world. His goal, when writing the novel, first published in the British newspapers, chapter by chapter, was multifaceted. He claims he wrote it to document the famine for future generations, to understand what had occurred. As you have seen, he did this previously at other times in his career. But you can't help notice he also wrote it to defend himself and the government's actions during the period. As such, the work could be seen as politically motivated. He gives a robust defense of the government policy and even claims the famine relief was successful. But 1.1 million deaths speak of a different story. Regardless, it gives a unique insight into his social and political outlook when discussing religion, economics, and Ireland as a whole. While Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom all his life, Trevelyan inherited arguably a colonial mindset when it came to Ireland. Perhaps as a symptom of being from a well-established family or from his experience as a colonial official in India, he at times held a dismissive tone when discussing Ireland. On the 2nd page of The Irish Crisis, for example, he writes, "What hope is there for a nation who lives on potatoes?" This, of course, lays the blame on the Irish people for the severity of the famine, instead of poor British policy. His tendency to write in such a manner reflects that he was a product of his time. Many British politicians blamed Ireland for its troubles, to absolve themselves of responsibility for its ills. Some even went as far as blaming the morality of the Irish people as the cause for the famine. For example, in 1846, newspaper The Economist blamed the Irish for the famine, as it was brought on by their own wickedness and folly. Trevelyan's writings did not fully escape this trope. However, Trevelyan did not write in a racial way about the Irish people, unlike some of his peers. He never strays into making remarks on the failures of the Irish character, but rather complains about how inefficient the agricultural industry was. Some historians, such as Robert Haynes, have argued that Trevelyan's focus of frustration was towards the landholding classes, not the predominantly Irish Catholic tenants. While praising some proactive landlords in the Irish crisis, he wrote that, quote, "Others have been guilty of that entire abandonment of duty, which has brought reproach upon their order. For the future this cannot be." Such landlords that he was criticizing were usually from British ancestry themselves. Perhaps his lack of racial prejudice is a result of his progressive political views for the time, or his fondness for collecting Irish paraphernalia helped him avoid such a bias. Ironically, for an English civil servant, he was an avid collector of Irish nationalist pamphlets. More likely, his lack of an openly racist view was caused by his Whig tendencies. The Whigs were the precursor to the modern Labour Party and took up progressive causes during Trevelyan's life. His sincere progressive beliefs, for the time, seemed to have kept him from adopting a more racial tone that his Tory counterparts dabbled. But he certainly held a common Britain-centric view when discussing Ireland. A second continuing theme in Trevelyan's writing is his staunch belief in laissez-faire economics. During his lifetime, the world saw the birth of capitalism, especially in Britain during the early 19th century. Government intervention in the markets was seen as a poor idea. Rather, the view that the market is a force that would correct itself, if left alone, was a mainstream view amongst Trevelyan and his peers in government. Now, this attitude impacted both his response to the famine and how he wrote about the topic. For example, the victims of the famine are not mentioned, but rather the economic ramification of their deaths are. He never once gives a human face to the suffering that occurred. He viewed the famine as paving a new opportunity to improve the country economically by becoming closer to Britain. He viewed it as his job to shift Ireland from a subsistence economy to one of agricultural capitalism. He even concludes in the Irish crisis with the hope that God may bless the generation, quote, "in which this great opportunity has been offered." Besides the severe lack of compassion shown, this also tells us that he was sincere in his economic beliefs. He viewed the famine largely as an economic and agricultural problem, not a humanitarian one. As stated previously, Trevelyan had a religious upbringing through his father. This is also reflected in the Irish crisis. He and many of his contemporaries viewed the famine as an act of God. In the Irish crisis, he refers to it as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. This was a common way of viewing the Great Hunger, especially from devout British Protestants in England, but also at times from Irish Catholics. Trevelyan did not go as far as some of his peers in this view, however. The more extreme end believed the famine was a punishment for Ireland's immorality. In other words, they brought a racial element into their view, or at least a sectarian one. Trevelyan, as a loather of sectarianism and with a genuine interest in Ireland, stopped short of this extreme narrative. Once again, I believe his Whig tendencies may have helped him moderate his view, although this has not stopped his vilification. Many of the supposed racist remarks made by Trevelyan has been misattributed to him, which has been abused by some historians. In no part of his writings does he use religion as a vehicle for prejudice. So what exactly could a reader perceive Charles Trevelyan's political and social outlook to be based on these writings? Broadly speaking, Trevelyan had a similar view to many of his peers in England, an almost spiritual belief in laissez-faire economics. A veteran of the East India Company, it is understandable that he approached the issue of the famine with such a mindset. And the lack of compassion shown towards the lower classes can be traced to this adherence to free trade. Interlinked with this was his belief in God. A member of the Anglican Church, he, like many of his colleagues, viewed the world through a religious framework. He believed that God could directly cause such a catastrophe, as the famine, for a higher purpose. But he differed from some in that due to a lack of sectarianism, he did not hold prejudice for other denominations. He did, however, view Ireland in a disconnected way like many of his countrymen, in a manner that could be described as colonial. This again is not surprising for a civil servant of the British Empire. This view also likely originates from his time in India as part of the colonial administration. In his example of his struggle for educational rights for Indians, he compares Ireland and Wales to India when discussing the teaching of English to foreign-speaking peoples. Regardless of his views, what he will always be immortalized for is as the man in charge of the civil service of the United Kingdom while 1.1 million of its citizens starved and died of disease. Thanks very much, guys, and I'll see you next time.